when you look at his LinkedIn or you read his profile is that he has just had a phenomenal career, a prodigious amount of stuff that he has accomplished. So I'm not going to go through all of it because that would take the whole hour. But just briefly, he is currently at OpenAI as a AI researcher. He did a PhD from Stanford. He worked at Facebook as a full-time engineer for a couple of years. He worked in finance at a company called DRW as a quant, and he also went to Caltech, which is one of the most intellectually rigorous schools in the world, and he did both math and physics. So pretty amazing. But what I thought was actually really interesting is we had the opportunity to meet Mo in person. He hosted us for dinner, and he's just genuinely a really friendly and nice person who's also very eager and happy to share how he has done so much in his career. And so that's the genesis of the talk. Mo is going to talk about how does he get more done per unit time compared to most of the people that certainly I know in my circle, he's way more productive. And I think Mo, you would probably agree that, just compared to the general engineer, you're just so much more efficient at getting the important work done. So appreciate you being here. Here's how the logistics are going to work. As you as Mo presents, you can put questions in the chat, and then periodically, maybe a couple times throughout the next 45 minutes or so, Mo will pause, and then Alex and I will do the job of trying to find good questions, and there'll be some interactivity that way. And at the end, if there's time remaining, then we can open the floor for questions as well. Okay? So with that, I think we're good to go. Mo, thanks so much for being here, and I'll let you take it away for efficiency tips for engineers.
Great. Thank you very much, Rahul and Alex, for hosting me today, and Rahul for the overly generous introduction. That was very kind of you. To give everyone a little bit more background about myself, so as Rahul mentioned, I'm currently at OpenAI. I joined OpenAI after completing my PhD in computer science last year. I finished in June 2023. I was over at Stanford. Before my PhD, I actually had an atypical path to the PhD in that I worked for 4 years in between my bachelor's and my PhD. As Rahul mentioned, I was at Facebook for 2 years. I was at a startup called Expanse for a year that was acquired by Palo Alto Networks later. And I was at DRW before that. As an undergrad, I did math and physics. I actually didn't know how to code as when I graduated. I learned entirely on the job afterwards. And a funny fact is that I actually knew Rahul's brother at Caltech. Now, for an outline of this talk, one thing I was thinking about titling this talk is things I wish I had known 20 years ago. And this talk is going to be a smorgasbord or a sampling platter of some of the highest leverage things that I've learned from my time continually trying to improve myself and perform better. We'll start this talk with ideas about strategy and principles for efficiency. Why do we want to be efficient, and how can we assess how we can become more efficient? I'll drill that down afterwards into more operational things, like setting up systems that make things faster or easier or cheaper. Often those things are a fixed cost, so amortized over your entire career, they're actually very cheap and very high leverage. Finally, we'll drill down into smaller level, lower level tactics, including apps and specific techniques that I use to be more efficient. Okay, let's get started. So the first thing I want to talk about is high level strategy at the very highest level. And if you haven't done this already, I think the best thing you can do is to determine what's important to you. What are your values? On your deathbed, what do you want to say you have done? How did you spend your time? This is actually a thought experiment that comes from 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. And the habit is start with the end in mind. What I really recommend doing to keep yourself aligned at an operational and tactical level is to write down your goals and stick them somewhere you can easily see them on your desk. Often these goals should be life goals, not just work goals, which include spending time with your friends and family, exercising, or finishing your work project. And everything else that comes across your desk, I think you should just cut as much as possible. Say no or find someone else to do it. If it's not aligned with your goals and your values or your work, the highest leverage thing you can do is just cross it off your to-do list, and that saves you a lot of time. Here, I'll briefly mention a study that's been replicated many times where The study conductors asked old people, what are your greatest regrets in life? And they often said spending time with friends and family was their greatest regret. They wish they had had more time there and taking care of their health. So it's very interesting. Very few people say they wish they had worked more, but for some people, that's also important. Okay, so this is the very highest level strategy that probably all of you have already done or thought about. Once you have established these goals, I really recommend profiling your time. And what I mean by that is as follows. If you wrote some code and you wrote a computer program, you would run a profiler to see where the code spends its time. Functions take the most amount of time? Where can you start speeding things up or optimizing things in order to save time? And what I recommend is treating yourself as a software program and profiling yourself. Now, the way you do this is important because self-logging post hoc, like the day after your work, is notoriously unreliable. Memory is very fickle. When I was in high school, I actually recorded myself with a camera and then manually tagged how I was spending each half-hour block to see was I actually allocating time towards my goals. Now, these days, there are many apps that do this much more easily for you. I personally use Rescue Time. Rescue Time gives you a productivity rating as to how much time you spent in different apps about your productivity. My highest productivity week was at 80%. This was actually during the NeurIPS deadline, the largest machine learning conference, and I was scrambling to get things done and deliver the best paper that I could. Usually, good weeks are more around 65% productive. So if you use this app, I'd be really interested in hearing your numbers too. And once you've done this and profiled your time, you can ask yourself this really important question, which is your time spent aligned with your goals? Are you actually allocating time in a way that's congruent with your value system and what you're trying to achieve with your life? Whether you are or not aligned with your goals, you can then organize and build systems. You've started to scope the problem and you can think about how to improve. You have a guiding light. One thought experiment I also encourage everyone to do is to assess how much is your time worth. So, for example, if you had the opportunity to work 1 hour for a single dollar, would you do that? What about for $10 or 100 or 1,000? And this also really helps you understand the trade-off between two of your resources, money and time, in getting things done. So this is the highest level takeaways that I would recommend getting started with if you're interested in being more efficient with your time. Next, I'm going to talk about some strategic tips that are slightly lower level, but still very high level in terms of how to spend your time. I'm going to talk about 6 principles in this section. The first, reuse, don't redo. The second being to make decisions in advance. I'll talk about the important versus urgent framework. And I'll talk about engineering frameworks versus research frameworks and how they're different. I also want to touch upon 2 deeply psychological concepts, including motivation and procrastination. So now this is a sampling platter of some of the most important things I've learned from my readings and my behavior, and I will go through each of these in greater detail now. So one of the most important things that a senior grad student told me when I was in grad school was to reuse, don't redo. Now, Taro had this excellent example of asking 2 different engineers, one so-called 10Xer and one junior engineer, how to build a web app. And the junior engineer got started learning all of these protocols like HTTP and SSL and trying to understand things from first principles to build it from scratch. Whereas the more senior engineer just used existing frameworks, wrote no code, and had the web app stood up much faster. And this is exactly what I suggest with reuse, don't redo. People have built frameworks and tools to make it easier to do what you're doing, almost without a doubt. And so if you're in engineering, I recommend using these existing frameworks as much as possible. If you lean on them, a lot of people have already done the hard work for you in terms of getting these products or these services standing up. I also highly recommend looking at open source stuff. Unless you're at a large company, probably the open source things have many more users, have found many more bugs, and are much more reliable and accurate than anything you could build yourself from first principles. A very common example of this is cryptography. The common joke is never implement something for security or cryptography yourself. Now, in terms of on the research or mathematical side, an example of reuse, don't redo that I really like is doing a literature review. So let's say you're writing a paper and you need to write your related work section. One way to go about it would be to go to Google Scholar and check for all the keywords related to your paper, scan the first 20 results for each keyword, see what's important, and then put that in your paper. Or what you could do is just find your nearest neighbor paper, the closest recent paper to yours, what you're writing, and lift their literature review from it. Now, you could still fill in the gaps like other papers between that paper and yours, or some other papers you found in your reading, but this is very high leverage to write the literature review much faster. And now there are tools like ChatGPT to also help with this. In terms of the mathematical side, you often don't need to know the detailed proofs like the analogs of HTTP or SSL, how things work under the hood. Often knowing the theorem statement is sufficient to use it. That's your interface to the result, just like a computer programming interface. And the general theme I would talk about here in reuse, don't redo is to find your nearest neighbor in doing whatever you're trying to do, whether that's build a web app or write a paper, and then reuse as much as possible, perhaps from a blog post that uses the same stack you want to for the same problem you have. Okay, so we've talked about reuse, don't redo. Another principle I really want to talk about, which helps strategic decision making, is to make decisions in advance. And the reason for this is that decision making on the fly tends to be very poor. The reason is because we are all, as humans, influenced by emotions and biases. Often we are presented with new information on the fly, and that information may be designed to tilt us in a specific way or make us think a specific thing. So, what I really recommend to be impervious to this is to run the scenarios in advance and decide what you'll do in each setting. In other words, if X happens, I'll do Y. An example of this is just setting a budget for yourself before you walk into a car dealership so that you don't walk out accidentally spending much more than you would have liked. Okay, we've talked about making decisions in advance. Let's now also talk about another framework which I found very helpful, which is this important versus urgent framework. Many of you might have seen this. It's also called the Eisenhower matrix, and it's very popular. Here, I have a 2x2 grid where the y-axis is the importance of tasks and the x-axis is the urgency of tasks. Now, you can categorize your tasks based on how important and urgent they are. If they're both important and urgent, they should be at the top of your priorities. You should do them now if possible. If they're important but not urgent, I recommend scheduling a time for them. So you'll know that they'll be done before their deadline, let's say, and you won't fall into this urgency fallacy where you keep doing urgent things at the cost of this important overarching arch that you might need to be doing but are putting on the back burners. If something is not important, but it is urgent, I recommend delegating if possible. This is maybe something someone else can help you with to get done as urgently as it needs to be done. And one of the highest leverage things you can do is look at your to-do list, figure out what's not important and not urgent, neither important nor urgent, and simply don't do those. If you can cross something off your to-do list and it doesn't take any time, that's one of the highest leverage things you can do in terms of getting things quote unquote done per unit time. Okay, we're in the middle of our strategic tips. I'll pause here. Rahul, do we have questions from the audience that you think would be good to cover now?
Yeah, there's one in particular that I thought would be good to get your thoughts on uh from someone who said, how do you go about ensuring not to go into a rabbit hole while solving a problem and staying on track? If you have any examples, that would be great. How do you decide what problems are worth solving? So this goes, I think, to the point that you said around reuse, not redo. So how do you
Yes.
know, where are you on that spectrum? If you're building a side project, for example, what parts can you delegate to a framework versus what part is the core like value prop of your project that you're building out? How do you think about that decision?
Yeah, I think this is a really fantastic question. And it's something I'm very guilty of myself. Once I we'll talk about this later in the talk, but we'll talk about how you get really motivated when you work on something and you think there are so many things you could do on top of that, and you just want to keep doing it. And what I really recommend is a priori, really write down what is absolutely core to your first launch. And what and also to time box it. So, what's your time budget? Have a deadline and commit to that budget. So, I think there's a VC, I don't remember who, but he said something like if you're not horribly embarrassed by your first release, you released too late, you took too long. I think engineers
That
in
was Reid
particular,
Hoffman, by the way, the
it
legend.
was. Okay. Thanks, Alex. Yes. So I think engineers in particular tend to take pride in their work and they want to release something very polished and very pretty. But really, there's this quote that perfection is the enemy of progress. And if you keep rabbit holing down, you're just going to develop something that might be very pretty, but you'll lose time and edge delivering value to the world. So, in terms of preventing rabbit hole, I say lock in your decisions in advance as to what's core, do it as quickly as possible, and ship it. I think that's the best advice I can give in a time boxed way as well. So you have a time budget.
That's great.
Thanks, Rahul. Yeah, that's a fantastic question. Okay, so now let's continue with other strategic tips. So I want to talk about I've been both a software engineer in industry and a researcher, and I want to talk about two different frameworks, which took me a very, very long time to learn. So I'm hoping to save all of you some more pain. So when you're doing an engineering project, both the problem and the solution are known. You typically know what you want to build and how to build it. Perhaps if you do a little bit of research and figure out what existing tools are out there. In these engineering problems, the largest costs are execution time. Someone needs to sit down and actually implement or write the code to do this. And typically in these settings, people, and I also recommend, people do the highest value per unit time things first. So if something would bring a lot of value to your team, your company, or your customers, and is really quick to do, I would suggest jumping at that. That's at the top of your priority list. Other things you might prioritize are getting an end-to-end system working. So you have your MVP and then fleshing out the details or additional functionalities after. And I think, Rahul, this goes back to the question from the audience about how do you prevent yourself from rabbit holing. Making sure your end-to-end system is working, and that's the concrete scope of the task, should be the priority and really helps. Now, this is very different from a research framework. In a research framework, both the problem and the solution are unknown. You typically don't know what question to ask, or once you've posed a question, how to ask it. And most things in research fail. That's actually expected. There's this latent variable, which we're not allowed to observe, which is, will this project succeed or not? And your responsibility as the researcher is to fail fast and reveal that latent variable if possible. So, how do you iterate and experiment on your problem and your proposed solution as quickly as possible? Here, the largest the largest costs are actually the costs of failure. So, getting through that failure loop, which is going to happen very often, and prototyping quickly is the best way you can improve your output. Now, in this framework, Google X uses this example that I really like. It's called a monkey on a pedestal. And in this example, your task is as follows. You want to train a monkey to recite Shakespeare on top of a pedestal. Now, if you were an engineer, the way you might go about this, which is reasonable in your engineering framework, is to build the pedestal first because you know how to do it. You can show your boss, oh, yes, indeed, I'm making progress on this. And you build this nice, fancy pedestal. And then when you get to the monkey, you realize this is impossible and you failed and you can't do this project. Another way to attack this problem would be to do the highest risk things first. So you start with the monkey, you realize it's impossible to get it to recite Shakespeare, and you move on to the next hypothesis. And in this way, you've actually saved a lot of time that you would have spent building the pedestal. Now, different frameworks, each framework is appropriate for different solutions. I think it's important to figure out which framework would be most applicable to the problems you're all facing in your daily work. Now, I want to touch upon as well two psychological concepts that I found extremely helpful in improving myself. The first is this actual psychological observation that motivation succeeds action, not precedes action. So I think there's this common myth where you can tell yourself, I'm going to hype myself up and I'm going to get all excited, and then I'll go take this action that I've been dreading taking. And that's actually not what psychological studies have shown. They show that actually the motivation comes after you've started doing what you're doing. All of that hype actually before you're starting the task may in fact be counterproductive. So, with this knowledge, what does that mean in terms of actionable advice? Often, the best thing you can do is to just get started, as platitudinous as that sounds. You're probably avoiding a task because it's stressful, and your stress is going to be highest when you're thinking, you're ruminating about starting. But I really like this quote that waiting doesn't make the water warmer. So, you're just going to dive into this cold water, and waiting actually just doesn't make it any warmer. In fact, it may make it colder because your dread is increasing and your stress as you avoid this task. So now that you have this idea, you want to just get started. How can we actually make that easier, right? It sounds so easy to say. Of course, if it were that easy, we'd all do it. But now I'd like to talk about some psychological tricks to actually make it easier to get started. One of the things that I tell myself is, oh, I'm just going to do it for 5 minutes. I'm actually much less scared of doing it for just 5 minutes. I know I might struggle a little bit, but then once those 5 minutes have elapsed, all the stress has been removed. It's a psychological trick. And then you can do it for much, much longer. You've already gotten started, which is the hard part. And once you've gotten started, you'll actually get more motivation. So you'll say, oh, okay, I understand what I need to figure out now. The problem is a little bit better scoped. I also want to build this thing on top of it or optimize this thing. So I found this do it for 5 minutes psychological trick that I tell myself to be very helpful. I also really like leaving a breadcrumb task for tomorrow morning. So typically, I do my hardest tasks first and I leave easier tasks towards the end of the day. And those easy tasks I leave for tomorrow, actually, some of them, so that I can get started very quickly tomorrow. In other places, this is called the make your bed principle. Obviously, making your bed doesn't do anything, it's just going to get messy the same day. But some people claim that making your bed means you've gotten the ball rolling and you'll feel more motivated to do other things on your to do list because you've accomplished the first task of the day. One of the other principles that I really like, which is also talked about in the new Taro productivity course, is to swallow the toad, also called eat the frog, and every permutation of that sentence. And really, what this means is to do the hardest thing first. So you can think about doing this in two ways. You can think like, okay, let me do the easy things that I know how to do first, and then the hard thing I'm kind of avoiding, so I'm going to leave towards the end of the day. And often the hard things are the most important. So if you run short on time, which we all inevitably do, the hard thing, which is the most important thing, gets pushed to the next day and it keeps rolling and rolling. The other way you could attack this problem is to do the hard and important thing first. And if you do that, then actually the rest of the day becomes much easier because you know you have only easier tasks to do throughout the rest of the day. And so if you eat the frog, your stress integrated over time will be lower. And I found this to be a very, very effective technique. Now that we've talked about motivation, I'd also like to talk about procrastination, which is a universal human thing. There's been a lot of recent research about procrastination and why we procrastinate. And this research really shows that it's not about laziness or willpower. Rather, it's about emotional management. Often, our ability to do tasks is governed by our perceived effort of that task and our perceived reward of completing that task. Now, often the perceived effort is actually very different from the actual effort. And people have different emotional responses to different tasks. So, for example, I think some people really hate. I'm personally trying to work on taking cold showers. I think it's going to be very painful, but then once I do it, it's perfectly fine. And so I tend to avoid my shower in the morning until I really have to do it before I go to work. Some people, for them, they have an emotional response to reading their email or checking their voicemail or something like this if someone has left a message. And just doing that can be very different level of difficulty for different people. One of the things I learned from another high performance person was that when he wakes up, he does he looks at his email first and he does all the ones that are stressing him out. So he really eats the frog first and gets that out of the way so that he's not stressed for the rest of the day. Now, some people's emotional responses to different tasks is severe enough that it leads to serious avoidance. Instead of doing this perceived hard task with some reward, you can do this perceived easy task with also some reward, which means scrolling on your phone, playing video games, or things that don't really solve your problems. And even worse, once you've done that, you usually feel worse about your procrastination and punish yourself and then avoid the task even more. This is like the water getting even colder instead of warmer. So, how do you break this loop and get to jumping in the water? I really recommend lowering the activation energy to do this task. And there are a couple of ways I really like to do this. So, one is to reward yourself after you complete that task. So, you say, oh, okay, I will write this code, and afterwards I can play 15 minutes of video games. And the funny thing will happen, which is that you'll write this code, you'll get started, and then you'll realize you actually don't need the 15 minutes of video games. So you can keep going. It's another psychological trick you can use on yourself. Another way to do this is to do it with friends or colleagues. And doing that and holding each other accountable in a positive way is often very helpful to everyone involved. Now, I'll pause here at this outline. We've talked about six strategic principles that I found to be very high leverage over my career. To recap them, they're reuse, don't redo, make your decisions in advance, pre-compute them, think about the important versus urgent framework and where your tasks fall in this framework. We've also talked about engineering versus research frameworks, and then we've touched on motivation and procrastination. So these things, they seem a little discombobulated. And what I wanted to do for this talk was really to provide the listeners the highest value things from each category that I found in my career. I'll pause here. Rahul, are there any good questions in the chat?
There are so many good questions in the chat. If you're okay with it, we can do two, maybe, Mo. So
Sure, that
the
sounds
first
great.
one is as it relates to the bottom two, motivation and procrastination. How do you think about there's a concept called body doubling. And the
Mhm.
idea is that you find a friend, a particular coworker, it could be multiple people, multiple friends. And the fact that you're together and you state your goal ahead of time, you get more motivation. Have you been able to formalize that or use that effectively either in the PhD program or maybe at OpenAI? In general, how do you think about social accountability as a way to prevent procrastination?
I think it's incredibly important and such a useful tool. So, one of the other things I really like is I like running personally. And I found that I'm far less likely to cancel a group run or not show up to my friends, especially if it's a small group and they expect me. I don't want to let them down, versus a solo run where I can just say, I'm tired, no one will know, and that's fine. So that's one of the reasons, Rahul, we were talking before this talk formally started about going into the office because I love going into the office. Even just the fact that I'm near my coworkers pushes me to do better. Whereas if I'm home alone, I might get more distracted. So I think that having especially small accountability groups where people do expect you, not like a big group where no one will miss you, is extremely important and effective.
Perfect. I like that. One more question. This is a really interesting one. How much of your success do you attribute to innate talent versus your discipline to carry out methodically all of these strategies that you've outlined?
Yeah,
Or it could be something like passion too, which is like you're just so passionate about the work that you're doing that you, like, do you have a sense of how much effort do you expend in doing the things that you're describing versus your peers, if you have an idea of that?
Yeah, and this is something I also thought about a lot. How much of my ability is innate talent versus behavioral things that have allowed me to do these things. And I thought about this a lot, especially when I was a teenager, because I wanted to figure out what's the ceiling on my abilities. You know, how far can I go? Can I really do what all these other people are doing? And I'll tell you, after working with some of the most performant people in their field, some very famous and very accomplished people, that they are only human and they actually struggle with a lot of things I struggle with, like a self-study program that lasts 10 weeks always falls off, even these like very accomplished researchers. And I really lie very heavily on the nurture side of the nature versus nurture framework.
Mm.
Hamming has a great discussion about this in a talk he gave called You and Your Research, that often people mistake a lot of hard work previously in the background that wasn't very visible for innate talent, because you see someone who's very good at something, you think, oh, they were born this way, but that's not really true. And there have been some very, very interesting studies. Like there are these chess sisters, I think the Polya sisters or the Polgar sisters, whose father raised them to be chess grandmasters. And I think they're some of the most successful female chess players of all time. And the same thing happened with Andre Agassi and the Williams sisters and Naomi Osaka, where really they could be trained to be the best in the world at what they're trying to do. And I really feel that most of it is training rather than innate ability. I think it's really just how hard you work and how smart you work and how you get things done. The last topic I'll touch on in response to that question is passion. I do enjoy what I'm doing, which makes it really much easier to devote a lot of time to it. And we'll talk later in this talk about an energy audit. One of the things that I think might be encouraging is that we touched on motivation, like motivation to do tasks, and how once you get started, you actually want to do more of it. And I really think that's how passions are built. I don't think I had a calling to math or engineering or something. I did a lot of it, I liked it, and then I developed a passion. And I think that's actually the case for most people. So thanks for the questions, Rahul, and from whoever in the audience that came from. Great. So now that we've talked about strategy, I want to move this talk down one level to operations. And how do we set up systems to be the best we can and to enable us to do the best work? And one of the things I find really, really important is to build in time for breaks. Now, I mentioned earlier, when profiling yourself, you might treat yourself as a software program. Unfortunately, humans are not software programs. And if you try to run in an imperative way, just doing one thing after another for your entire execution lifetime, you will inevitably burn out. And building in time for breaks is really, really important to prevent that burnout, both on a daily scale as well as a monthly or yearly scale. And everyone says this, and it's found to be universally pretty much true, that you need these breaks. And often that actually helps you perform better, because if you take a break during the middle of the day, you can actually work longer throughout the day. Or if you take a break during your month, you come back refreshed. Another technique I found really helpful operationally is what's called a dopamine fast. So I know it's involved in a lot of pseudoscientific influencer stuff right now, but I actually have tried it and do find it helpful. And what a dopamine fast is just spending some time where you don't accept any stimulus from the environment. So you don't have your phone, you don't have your laptop, you're not listening to music, you may just lie in your bed doing absolutely nothing. And something really interesting happens after you do this, which is that after 15 minutes, you'll be so bored that you will accept anything exciting. You'll actually want to do your work because there's some perceived dopamine hit after or before you do your work. And I think this is another way to lower the barrier to entry, the activation energy for procrastination. So you might want to procrastinate by playing video games or being on your phone. But if you just to say, I'm doing nothing and I'm not allowed to do anything else until I do task A, you will actually do task A pretty quickly, as long as you don't have an out to something else that's a quick dopamine hit. A lot of people in this book, Tools of Titans by Tim Ferriss, so a lot of people universally recommend meditation to be outside of your own body and to assess as a neutral third party how you're doing. It's something I'm still working on. I usually fall asleep when I meditate, but if you have success with meditation, let us know in the comments. Another operational tactic that I really, really like is time blocking. So every night before I go to sleep, I schedule actually my entire day tomorrow. This goes back to doing things like actually the important versus urgent framework. I can decide what's important to do tomorrow. This goes back to pre-computing your decisions. So knowing exactly what you'll do at each time tomorrow is a way to save this analysis paralysis, and also keeps you accountable. Now, one of the things I really like doing is having generous time blocks with buffers so that throughout the day I feel like I'm ahead of schedule and I feel more excited to continue working. Whereas if I'm behind schedule, it's more stressful. So, another psychological trick I play on myself. One of the things I highly recommend is doing an energy audit. So, interestingly, when we were at Facebook, they didn't define a strength as something that you were good at or bad at. They defined a strength as something that gave you energy, and a weakness as something that drained you of energy. And that's really interesting to think about because theoretically, if you just gained energy from doing something, it becomes a positive feedback loop and you can keep doing that. And one of the open questions I have for myself, and I'd love to hear from members of the audience at some point, is can I condition myself to be more energized? How do I change a weakness to a strength in this framework? In terms of another operational technique throughout the day that helps you from getting tired, I also recommend the Pomodoro technique, where you work for a fixed amount of time and then you take a break for a fixed amount of time. And you have to be intentional about your breaks. If you just read your email and then respond to messages, that's actually tiring. You don't give yourself time to rest. So it's important. It's like working out and doing sets with rest in between, where you work for some period of time and then take a break. Okay, I want to take a minute here to talk about focus and your phones. And I think this is really important. It's also touched on in the new Taro course about productivity. So someone once asked both Bill Gates and Warren Buffett that to write on an index card, what's the most important trait of yourself that has led to your success? And both of them actually wrote the same word on the index card and then showed it to each other, which was focus. It turns out that when you're in deep work and you're not distracted, your efficacy and your efficiency skyrocket, maybe as large as 3x. So if you're coding, often software engineers enter actually a physically state of flow, like their galvanic skin response actually changes and is similar to what people experience during meditation. And that's when they do their best and most efficient work. Now, there is something that's constantly pulling you out of flow, which are your smartphones. And there's been a lot of study, especially recently, that smartphones lead to anxiety and hypervigilance. So you're getting this random reinforcement schedule from your phone. The dopamine hit actually happens in anticipation of something happening on your phone. And this constant exposure to these chemicals and these endorphins actually leads to negative long-term side effects. Now, I remember as a kid, before I had a smartphone and I was at home and I could only use my computer at the desktop, where it was in the living room. I remember spending much more time reading books, talking to family, and generally feeling much more peaceful. So I think there really is something to this research where you can still spend your time in a very profoundly content way, not addicted to your phone. One of the other things I really like to do, let me pull up my phone here, is to grayscale it. So you can make your phone, oh, I turned it off for this talk, but let me turn it back on. You can actually set your phone to be only grayscale and remove the colors, and this will immediately make it far less addicting. So I think this is a powerful technique. Sorry, this at least exists in iPhone. I don't know about Android, but it's an accessibility tool, which I find very helpful.
I have an Android as well, Mo. I use it.
Perfect. Perfect. Amazing. So I think that's very exciting. And now let me see if I can show you my phone, which is just completely gray here. It looks far less attractive, it's far less interesting. And I want to challenge everyone in the audience to go without your phone for a single day. And initially, if you're like most people in the world, that actually brings you some anxiety, some thought like, oh, what if I miss some messages or something or don't respond? But you'll find after the first hour or so that it's actually quite liberating. So this is homework for everyone in the audience. Okay, now that we've talked about operations, I'll move to some lower level stuff like tactical things that I think are more helpful. Now, I think we're running a little short on time, so I'm going to continue moving forward. And I want to talk about some tactical efficiency things, especially on the technological side for software engineers and researchers. Often you'll find that you're doing something a lot, and you should naturally ask the question, how can I do this faster? One of the best things you can do is just get to know your hotkeys. That includes on your terminal, on your IDE, and on your Mac or PC or Linux machine. These hotkeys save you a ton of time because you don't have to move your hand to your mouse. And mouse use is also linked with repetitive strain injuries and so on. And this is another challenge that I issue to everyone in the audience. Go without your mouse for a day. So just disable your trackpad or unplug your mouse and force yourself to learn the keyboard shortcuts. You may go a little slower on the first day, but everything will get faster afterwards. Also, really recommend at a tactical level getting more screens. So, a large software company tried to do a study of how to make their software engineers more productive. And the answer across the board was literally just to get more screens. And apparently, this helps up to like 9 screens. So, something you should definitely invest in if you can afford it. In terms of other tactical systems, things like scheduling meetings. There are many, many apps out there now to just schedule them one click to show your availabilities and or some offerings of your available times and to do that. If you find yourself having frequent communications of the same type, document them. So, and then send people a link to your documentation. This is like people asking you questions about your code at work. Instead of answering everyone individually with the same Q&A, you document it and point people to that documentation. And you can do that for other scenarios in your life as well. In terms of efficiency behaviors, one of the lessons I really like is no imaginary rules. So when I was this saying, when I was very important to me because when I was younger, I used to think, oh, I have to do task A before doing task B. And often that predicate wasn't actually true. If you really investigate that, task B is completely decoupled from task A. And so I encourage you to think when you have those thought patterns, is that an imaginary rule? I recommend speed reading things. An app I really like for this is Swift Read. So it turns out that your brain can actually process information much, much faster than you can read it because of the speed of your eye movement. So what these apps do is keep text in a specific place and then cycle the text so you don't have to move your eyes. Really recommend using speech to text on your phone when you're texting people. It's a little harder when coding, but I've been told that if you do set that up, it is actually makes you much more efficient. In terms of other behaviors, I really recommend memorizing common function names or theorems that you're using. Don't look them up every time. There's actually a psychological bias that if something is easy to look up, you'll forget it more easily. So maybe as kids, some of you may remember like you found a new word and you actually went to the dictionary and found it in the sorted order and then learned the meaning. And then you remembered those much better than if you just looked up a word on Google or something. So actually putting that pain in will actually help you remember things better. You should be able to write programs from scratch and without references. And if you do need to look something up, at least make a guess as to what you need. That way you can correct yourself in the future. For reading papers, highly recommend printing them out. Your focus is much stronger than if you read them on your laptop or some other digital device. Another life hack that I really like from the Getting Things Done framework is if something takes less than 2 minutes, do it now. If you put it on your to-do list or you're thinking about it, you're actually paying interest on the time it takes to do it. So for example, responding to emails, I usually respond to them as soon as I see them. A quick cheat sheet that I'd like to leave you all with is say no to as much as you can. This is actually one of the highest leverage things you can do. A common pitfall I see many people falling into is accepting every calendar invite that comes their way from work. You can just ask, are you actually needed at that invite? Could you provide your thoughts asynchronously? Would that be sufficient? I also really recommend thinking about what can be satisficed and just good enough or optimized and really needs to be pushed as far as it can go. And in these decisions, time boxing these things. So this goes back to the question of going down a rabbit hole. Make sure that you have a cutoff for making the decision, schedule that decision. And there's this interesting paradox that choosing between two close options is often harder than two very disparate ones. So if you know one option is very good and one is very bad, it usually takes very little time to figure that out. But often we as humans, get into this framework of splitting hairs between something that has value X and something that has value X plus epsilon. And those decisions are actually the least consequential. Also, should go without saying, having a routine is super important. This is about making your decisions and scheduling your day in advance. Highly recommend being as receptive to feedback as you can. It's often much easier to improve when you have a coach, even if that's some coworker or neutral bystander that can give you tips to improve. I love feedback so much that I have an anonymous feedback form on my website that anyone attending this talk is welcome to submit. And I would love some feedback from you as to whether you found this talk helpful. Also, read as much as you can. I think that there are a lot of products out there which are short form content designed to hack your attention. But if you can read long form content that really helps you improve, I found that to be the most valuable. And here, for some further reading, this is the last slide. I really want to thank the Taro community. I've learned a lot from Alex and Rahul and other members of the Taro community. So it's really a privilege to be contributing back. I believe that Taro just released a new course on productivity, which in fact covered a lot of the things I talked about today. I briefly skimmed it. It looks great. I think it's very much more detailed about what I've talked about here. I've also recommended some books here, including Principles by Ray Dalio, Atomic Habits by James Clear, Seven Habits of Highly Effective People, which I referenced earlier by Stephen Covey, Tools of Titans by Tim Ferriss, and Deep Work by Cal Newport. I think we're at time here, so I'll say thank you everyone for coming, and depending on how much more time we have, we can open up for Q&A.
Amazing. Can we all give a heart emoji to Mo? This is just such a dense and efficient talk. So I really appreciate it, Mo. Thank you for doing it. So if we have 10 minutes left, Mo, if that's okay with you, we can just go through questions. Before we go through the questions, three things. So first of all, Mo has this amazing idea of a feedback form embedded into his website. I dropped a link for that earlier. Alex, if you don't mind, that could be one link to drop. I think Alex did drop the link for what Mo mentioned, the productivity course, which is newly launched. We can drop a link for that. And then finally, LinkedIn, is that the primary place that people could contact you, Mo, or like where people can follow up?
Yes, LinkedIn and Twitter are both great. I should be easily findable on both those platforms.
Okay, perfect. We'll drop links to all of those, the feedback form on your website, LinkedIn, Twitter, and then also the productivity course. There's a bunch of questions. We're definitely not going to get through everything, but I want to start off with just a few. So one interesting question that we got was things inevitably go wrong. So you have a deadline and you miss a deadline for a paper submission or a project at work. In those scenarios, what do you do? Do you have some sort of mechanism to punish yourself or like tell yourself how to prevent that in the future? What kind of action do you take when a deadline gets missed?
Yeah, and missing deadlines is absolutely inevitable. Everyone's doing that. And if you're not missing deadlines, at least once in a while, you're probably being too generous with your deadlines. And
Yeah.
I think there are two levels at which I think about this. The first is how does this impact other people? If I know I'm going to miss a deadline and there are other stakeholders or dependents, I let them know as soon as possible because now the missing the deadline is fixed. I'd rather tell them as soon as possible so that they can accommodate and change things on their end and lessen the impact on them. So that's the first thing I do. The other thing I do sort of tactically is I give them an updated deadline so they know when they can expect this to be done for their dependent systems. Now, on a more philosophical and kind of engineering side, yes, my rule for myself is that I can make every mistake once. In fact, I'm encouraged to make every mistake once, but not more than once. So if I make a mistake, there's a post-mortem in terms of thinking, hey, how could I have done better? Maybe the answer is I just was like really bad about estimating my time. So actually, some feedback I got from a product manager at Facebook was, Mo, you're too optimistic, you're too happy, and that causes you to underestimate timelines. You say you can get it done in a day, but it'll actually take a week. And that feedback was extremely accurate, and I took it to heart. I would suggest not punishing yourself in this. It seems a bit harsh, and you'll probably avoid taking risky decisions in the future or setting aggressive deadlines for fear of that punishment. Just accept that it happens, and you'll do better next time.
I love it. And then one more, and then maybe I'll ask Alex also to see what questions he's able to pull out. But one more that I thought was interesting is going back to reuse versus redo. There does seem to be a tension between getting things done versus learning.
Yes.
And I'm sure it depends on where you are in the project life cycle and perhaps where you are in your career life cycle. Are you optimizing for learning or getting things done? How do you think about that? Do you a priori, like before you begin a big thing, a big project, do you declare this is more designed for just efficiency rather than learning? How do you think about that tension?
Yeah, this is actually a great question that I wanted to touch upon, but I think I skipped over too quickly. A lot of times it is important to do the details yourself. For example, if you're taking a course, and doing some math problems or something like this, you have to do the problems yourself. If you were to reuse the answers from somewhere else, you don't learn anything. So I think what I typically do when I analyze a project is I ask myself, am I going to need these techniques in the future? If the answer is no, I just need to do a one-off, I'll just reuse something. This is not going to be valuable for me to drill into the details in the future. If the answer is yes, and I am going to use this technique in this future, I might spend some more time reading about it, figuring out what's important about this framework, what can I learn and take to my future applications that might be useful. So that's usually how I trade off the tension between learning, because it may be valuable for you to know these details in the future, versus just getting things done as quickly as possible. That's a really great question. So thank you to whoever asked that.
Yeah, I think it was Kevin, if I recall correctly. Alex,
Cool.
did you have any questions that you wanted to pull out? I feel like you've been monitoring the chat much better than me.
Oh yeah, yeah. I'm just trying to respond to everything in the chat. I can't keep up, but yeah, thanks everyone for the great questions. There was one that stood out to me. It was like the first one in the chat actually. Is how do you identify rabbit holes versus like genuinely complex problems that you should take the time to understand?
Yeah. Oh boy. I think in terms of rabbit holing versus this is actually hard, I think the easiest way to do this is to ask someone with more experience than you. So this comes up in research a lot when you're learning about a new topic. It's like, hey, am I doing something stupid? And like, hey, like the answer to this is known, or like people know how to do this. Or is this in fact a hard, novel problem which people have thought about but haven't made a lot of progress? And in each setting, if you have a mentor or you have a colleague that you can ask to de-risk that, I find it very, very helpful. And I think that'll prevent you from going down a rabbit hole and potentially spending a lot of time on something that has a known solution and telling you whether you're the problem or the problem is the problem.
One more. I'm going to combine this question from Kato with another one as well. His question or her question is, how do you become efficient in something like leak code where you have no outside accountability, it's inherently difficult, and you're not rewarded until the very end? There's also a kind of a related thing, which, before when we first connected, Bo, you mentioned how you're working at OpenAI, one of the hottest companies in Silicon Valley or in the world right now. And you mentioned a pretty methodical process that you had to land a job there, which I thought was really impressive. We won't go into that right now, but I think both leak code and also this idea of networking to get what you want. There's a really ambiguous, unknown outcome, which may or may not
Yes.
come true. How do you think about motivation and accountability for that kind of difficult, ambiguous task, which is not, there's no clear deadline or no clear outcome?
Exactly. And I think that this is also a problem I had to get used to in graduate school. Like when you want to write a paper, the feedback is extremely delayed. You don't know if your idea was good until maybe at least 6 months, after you've started it. Maybe even more if it takes you a long time to work on the project, submit it, wait for feedback, etc. And I think that there are several ways to induce some sort of feedback on a more consistent cycle. One is just appreciating the process. So rewarding yourself for just putting in an hour of leak code a day. Say, I'm only allowed to do this thing I like play video games, or I don't know, you can even use candy on your desk or something, maybe some low sugar thing. But just hack your brain to actually appreciate the process rather than the outcome. And I
Mm.
think that in terms of these long horizon tasks, like getting a job or publishing a paper, it's really important to start with the end in mind. So write down what you want to do and then all the subtasks needed to get there. So what's going to help you get there, like lead code, like networking, etc. And allocate time and enjoy the process for each of those. So somehow hack your reward system to enjoy things on a shorter cycle. And another way to do this is accountability groups. You see your friend, you're going to lead code together. Your friend's going to be disappointed if you don't do your 1 hour a day. That's a powerful motivator too.
Okay, we are almost at time here. I'm going to drop those three links that I mentioned from before one last time, the feedback form, Mo on LinkedIn, and the productivity course that is on Taro now. Uh, Mo, I really appreciate you doing this. You're the kind of person who is, I think, aspirational to so many people within Taro. So if you ever want to come back, produce a course, do an event, we would love to have you. So
Thank you.
yeah, thank you so
Thank,
much. If there's any last message you want to share with people, then would love to hear that.
I'd just like to say I thank you, Rahul and Alex, for hosting me. This has been a lot of fun. Thank you to the hundreds of participants that showed up today. And this is a two-way process. I gave a lot of prescriptive solutions here, but I'd really love to hear what works for everyone else too. So let's kick off a discussion, and I'd love to hear from you, especially if you disagree with something I said, and we can figure out what works best for everyone. So thanks again to the Taro community, and hope to be in touch with all of you soon.